Fred Lewis was supposed to lose this season. His wash plant died, his main gear collapsed, and half the crew figured the claim was done. But the moment everything failed, the gold started getting richer. Buckets that should have been empty came up heavy. Test pans that should have read 0 flashed yellow. And within days, Fred realized he'd stumbled into something no miner expects this late in the game. A deposit growing stronger the deeper he went. Old trenches lined up with military survey marks, strange black sands appeared where they shouldn't, and buried samples hinted that someone decades ago tried to chase the same mystery. Then, suddenly, walked away. By the time the backup trommel roared to life, the mats were overloaded with pickers, the fault line revealed itself, and the paleo channel proved real. This wasn't luck. This was a once-in-a-generation $90 million surge. Before we jump in, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what Fred Lewis uncovers this season takes Gold Rush into territory nobody expected. The day Fred rolled onto the new claim, you could almost feel the tension in the air. The maps, the assays, the satellite readings, everything said this ground should be solid. But standing there, boots sinking into uneven, chewed-up soil, Fred could already tell something wasn't right. The place didn't look untouched. It looked disturbed, as if someone had tried something here long before he arrived and didn't want anyone else to notice. The terrain was rougher than any survey suggested, full of warped trenches and sudden dips carved into the permafrost. Yet the first test pan he washed shimmered with an unexpected fan of fine gold. More gold than any untouched ground should be showing on a simple surface test. That first glint lit the crew up. Jokes started flying, bets started forming, and for a moment the whole camp felt like they were standing on the edge of a season-defining win. But Fred didn't share the whole truth. Half his equipment was on borrowed time. Bearings overdue, belts thinning, hydraulics patched together with hopes and late-night fixes. One major breakdown, and his entire season could stall before it even found its rhythm. Still, the payoff in that pan was too strong to ignore. And there was something else, too. A narrow old trench cutting across the claim like a scar. It wasn't on any of the maps. It wasn't part of any documented dig. And the way it ran, straight, deliberate, deeper on one end than the other, it told a story. Someone had worked this ground. Someone with enough knowledge to chase a specific line, but for some reason stopped abruptly and left without explanation. That trench bothered Fred, but it didn't stop him. The only way to know what was really here was to start running dirt, so he pushed the crew to fire up the wash plant immediately, even if the machine coughed and rattled like it already knew what kind of season was coming. Within minutes, everything went sideways. Before the first bucket had even finished cycling, the plant shuddered, groaned, and locked up. A grinding metallic crack shot across the yard. The feeder seized. A bearing deep in the housing snapped clean through, something that absolutely should not break this early. The crew killed the engines and rushed the plant, expecting to see rocks wedged in the grate or maybe a jam in the hopper, but what they found made no sense. Everything was clear. No jam, no overload, no obvious cause. The machine just failed. But the moment the mats were pulled, the mood changed again. Right there, smeared across the riffles, was a streak of coarse, bright gold. Bigger pieces than this ground should produce, especially this high up. It wasn't placer-style flood gold. It wasn't the usual flaky fines. This was the kind of material you see when you're right on top of a concentrated pressure pocket. Gold forced into tight spaces by decades of shifting earth, compressed, enriched, and trapped. And if that was true, then this claim might not just be promising. It might be hiding a misunderstood deposit abandoned by miners who didn't understand the geology at the time. Fred stared at the mats, then at the old trench, then at the broken feeder. The whole thing felt connected, but the pieces didn't line up yet. With the equipment down, he had no choice but to slow down and dig into the history of the place. That night, long after the crew went back to camp, Fred sat in the office trailer pulling old files, scans, and archival surveys. Most were generic government documents, but buried inside a dusty folder labeled 1947 Recon, he found something strange: handwritten notations from a military surveying crew referencing mineralized shear zones running directly beneath the region. It was a phrase that didn't show up in any modern report. But the more Fred studied it, the more it clicked. Shear zones meant pressure. Pressure meant movement, and movement meant pay lines shifting over time. According to the old records, the ground in this area had experienced 3 significant shifts in the last 70 years. If those shifts nudged the pay line even a few feet each time, then everything the early miners believed about where the gold should be would have been completely wrong. Their trench might have been cutting just beside the true pay streak, missing it by inches. Fred cross-referenced the old survey sketches with his GPS data, overlaying the 1940s notes onto the modern terrain. And there it was, a clean, undeniable alignment. The forgotten shear zone ran directly beneath the spot where his feeder broke, the exact location where the mats showed coarse gold that shouldn't be there. The kind of coincidence miners don't ignore. Which meant one thing: the richest line on this entire claim might be sitting right under the most unreliable, overworked, barely holding together piece of equipment he owned. And if that was true, then the breakdown wasn't the season falling apart. It was the season revealing its first real clue, pointing him toward a deposit nobody alive had ever properly mapped. And as Fred stepped out into the cold night air, staring toward the silent wash plant, he knew this ground wasn't rough by accident. Something had happened here. Something big enough for miners to chase, military crews to map, and decades of shifting earth to bury again. That certainty left him with only one next move. By first light, the crew was already heading for the one feature that had refused to make sense since day one: the old trench. With the military survey marks now overlaid on their GPS grid, everything clicked into place. The trench wasn't random, and it wasn't a prospector's test scrape. It ran in a perfect line that matched the 1940s shear zone notation almost to the inch. A cut that deliberate meant somebody knew exactly what they were following. Fred dropped into the pit with a spade and headlamp while the crew widened the edges. Beneath the tangle of silt and roots, they uncovered rusted industrial bolts and rotted canvas sample bags, proof that whoever worked this ground wasn't guessing. They were chasing a target with intent. But what stopped them? There was no collapse, no abandoned machinery, no sign of a failed blast. Then Fred scraped at the lowest layer and felt it. Wet gravel, still saturated even after years of freeze-thaw cycles. Water. If whoever dug this trench struck an underground seam or slow-flowing channel, the pit could have flooded fast, the kind of sudden surge that forces a crew to abandon everything and retreat. They might have been inches from the real pay line and never known. The deeper Fred dug, the more obvious it became. The ground was pointing down, not sideways. The pay line didn't end here. It dropped. With the main wash plant still crippled, Fred didn't have the luxury of chasing that depth with full-scale gear. Instead, he hauled the crew back to the yard and pulled out the battered, sun-faded backup trommel, an older unit they normally used for scraps, test patches, and half-frozen material no one expected to pay much. It rattled, it squealed, and every weld on it looked like it wanted to quit. But it ran, and that was enough. When the first bucket went in, nobody looked excited. The trommel belonged in a museum more than on an active mine site. It chewed the gravel unevenly, spat oversized rocks off at odd angles, and ran slower than the crew wanted. But after a few hours, when they shut it down for a quick cleanup, the disbelief set in. The mats weren't filled with the usual fine specks and scattered flour gold that old machines tend to catch. They were dotted with heavy rounded chunks, weathered gold, the kind that forms close to bedrock fractures where the metal sits and ages. Pieces that haven't traveled far. Gold that hasn't been eroded to nothing. This wasn't surface gold. This wasn't runoff gold. This was structural gold, the kind sitting right on top of the system that generated it. Fred crouched over the concentrate, flipping pieces between his fingers, silently recalculating everything. If these old nuggets were this coarse, this heavy, and this shallow, then the deposit beneath them was much larger than anything he'd assumed. The trench diggers decades ago might have only touched the shoulder of the real pay path. They didn't stop because the gold ran out. They stopped because the water drove them back before they hit the heart of it. With each cleanup from the backup trommel, the story grew clearer. The gold wasn't scattered, it clustered, and those clusters were tracking a line, one almost identical to the shear zone pattern from the military records. Fred marked each pickup on the GPS tablet, drawing a rough corridor across the cut. The first few points looked random, but the more they dug, the more undeniable the pattern became. It was trending downward, narrowing into a funnel, converging like a vein of pressure pushing everything into a single deeper point. Then, halfway through the next cut, the ground lit up. It started with one pan, then another, then bucket after bucket. Every run showed more gold than the last. Cleanups climbing by the minute. Within a span of 12 feet, the gold count didn't double, didn't even triple. It spiked nearly 300%. A jump like that doesn't happen without a geological reason. Something in the ground had concentrated massive amounts of gold into a tight channel, and the crew could feel it. Work slowed because everyone kept stopping to stare at the mats, waiting for the next wave of gold to reveal itself. Fred paced the cut, examining every exposed wall, every shift in gravel color, every thin layer of fine material that hinted at old river action. But nothing explained the magnitude of the spike. The bedrock map indicated nothing unusual here, just standard glacial gravels tapering onto mixed substrate. No fault mark, no basalt intrusion, no quartz stringer that could reasonably account for a pocket that concentrated gold at this scale. Then one of the crew scraped deeper along the far edge and hit a layer that didn't belong. A compacted strip of jet-black sand, heavy and mineral-rich, fused so tightly it felt almost metallic. Black sand usually means magnetite, iron, or volcanic residue, materials that trap heavy elements like gold. But this layer was too thick, too consolidated, and too sharply defined to be random. It ran like a seam through the cut, slicing beneath the pay streak like a hidden shelf. Fred knelt down, running a handful of the black sand between his gloves. It clung like it had weight. Too much weight, the kind of dense material associated with rapid directional change. Waterfall drops, plunge pools, ancient drop-offs where heavy gold collects and stays. That trench decades ago might have been searching horizontally, but this seam said the real action was vertical. Whatever forces shaped this claim had pushed gold downward into a natural plunge zone, a buried bowl of concentrated pay that early miners didn't have the tools to detect. The more of the black layer they exposed, the clearer the picture became. The gold spike aligned with the edge of the plunge, a lip where heavy pieces rolled and dropped into deeper pockets. The trench diggers had only touched the top. Fred was scraping along the side, and somewhere below, untouched for 70 years, was the bottom, the place where gold settles and waits for lifetimes. The backup trommel couldn't chase that depth, but Fred didn't care. The trench, the records, the shear zone, the weathered nuggets, the black sand. None of it was random anymore. It formed a map pointing straight toward the plunge zone, and the only way to reach it was with full plant power. So Fred headed back to the wash plant with a toolbox full of parts stripped from every dead, forgotten, or half-salvaged machine on the property. Bearings, brackets, feeder plates, anything that could be repurposed. By the time he finished welding, bolting, and hammering the patchwork together, the feeder looked like a Frankenstein rebuild, mismatched metals and heat scars covering its frame. But it spun freely. It didn't grind. And for the first time since the breakdown, the plant sounded like it wanted to work. The crew fired it up and fed the first bucket, expecting nothing more than a basic test run. Instead, before the gravel had even finished clearing the grizzly, the mats began flashing gold. Not specks, not fines, but pickers, thick, bright pieces tumbling into the riffles so fast the crew froze in disbelief. Fred leaned over the sluice, wiping the spray from his glasses, watching piece after piece catch in the slats. It wasn't just good gold. It was the kind of large, undeformed gold that shouldn't be sitting anywhere near the surface of ground like this. Nuggets shaped like melted droplets, cut by time, not by river movement. Gold that hadn't traveled horizontally through gravel beds. Gold that had risen from deeper geological layers. Vertical migration, one of the rarest scenarios in mining. Usually, gold moves through water, sideways, following channels and old river paths. But when gold moves upward, something powerful beneath it is pushing it. Fred stared at the pieces, turning one in his fingers. Old, thick, heavy. Nothing like the fine gold the region was known for. Before he could say anything, the geologist they'd consulted earlier in the season came running from the truck, eyes wide, saying the only thing that could explain that kind of upward movement was fault uplift, a break in the Earth's crust, forcing ancient gold-bearing structures upward toward the surface. That kind of event reshapes entire claims. Fred replayed the trench alignment in his mind, the black sand layer, the strange gold spike. It all fit a single explanation. This claim wasn't just mineralized. It was sitting on a hidden geological uplift, a fault so subtle no one had ever identified it because the signs were buried beneath decades of permafrost, seasonal shifts, and half-finished digs. To confirm it, they brought in portable LiDAR, rarely used on small-scale operations, but essential now that the ground was rewriting its own history. As the scanner swept across the claim, a new map formed, one that ignored soil, vegetation, and debris, showing only the underlying structural shape of the land. And there it was, stretching the entire length of Fred's permit. A narrow rise, too gentle for the naked eye, but unmistakable when stripped to bare topography. A ridge caused by subtle but consistent uplift, the same ridge the military surveys hinted at, the same ridge the trench followed, the same ridge where both coarse gold and black sand aligned like beads on a string. Old miners had dug along it, chasing the signs, but they never crossed it. They followed the uplift horizontally, never realizing the real gold had been pushed upward through the fracture and then dropped vertically into pockets just beyond where they stopped. They didn't understand the fault. They didn't have LiDAR. They didn't have pressure zone mapping. They just had shovels and instinct. And instinct had gotten them close, but not close enough. Fred knew what that meant. To reach the heart of the uplift, he'd have to dig deeper than regulations normally allowed without specialized clearance. It wasn't something he could just do quietly. So he spent half a day on calls, paperwork, and emergency permit requests. By evening, he had temporary authorization to excavate the uplift zone to depths normally restricted because of collapse risk. It wasn't permanent approval, just enough time to probe the ridge before the inspectors returned. The next morning, the crew broke ground with the excavators, peeling back layers that hadn't seen daylight since the last ice age. Immediately, the gravel changed. It grew denser, heavier, compacted in a way that made even the big excavators struggle. This wasn't normal overburden. This was material formed under immense pressure. Every bucket came up like it weighed double. The backup trommel couldn't even handle the first scoop. They had to route the material through the main plant in short bursts to avoid shearing belts or burning motors. Then the excavator teeth scraped something unexpected. Rounded stones, smooth and water-worn, in a layer far below the current water table. Ancient river cobbles, not glacial leftovers, not scrape-and-drag deposits. These were from a river that flowed here long before any modern channel existed. Evidence of a paleo system buried under uplifted ground. Fred climbed down into the cut, running his hand across the cobbles, feeling the shift from sharp gravel to polished stone. If gold had settled here, it hadn't been touched in thousands of years. When they shoveled the first test bucket and panned it, nobody spoke. The gold didn't appear piece by piece. It poured out of the pan like a handful of shimmering shot. Not big nuggets this time, but thick, heavy, ancient placer gold. Material that had settled in the bottom of a paleo channel and remained locked away through entire geological cycles. Fred kept swirling the pan, watching more flakes rise from the black sands gathered at the bottom. When he tapped the pan, the gold clumped together in a tight, shimmering streak that didn't want to spread out. That only happened when gold was so dense it resisted water flow. Fred didn't even need to say it out loud. The crew understood the moment the pan tilted. This wasn't just an extension of the uplift. This was the channel itself, the original bed where gold dropped before being sealed away by shifting earth and rising faults. An untouched paleo channel, the kind that could feed entire mining districts if followed long enough. Everything the trench hinted at, everything the black sand suggested, everything the uplift pointed toward. It all led here, into this deep, ancient path nobody before them had ever reached. And if the first pan looked like this, then the deeper they went, the older and richer the gold would become. Fred scanned the wall of the cut, seeing not dirt, but history layered into the earth. The uplift had pushed the structure upward. Time had sealed it. And now their machines were the first to break through. Fred looked at the ridgeline, the trench, the glittering mats, the ancient cobbles under his boots, every clue from the beginning of the season converging on one undeniable truth. The channel was real, it was bigger than anyone guessed, and the only way forward was to follow it wherever it led, no matter how deep or unstable the next stretch of earth became. With that certainty, Fred signaled the crew to tighten the cut walls, reposition the pumps, and prepare for a push into the heart of the paleo channel. Once everything was shored up, they drove the excavator straight into the line Fred had marked as the theoretical bottom. The gravel changed instantly. Denser, heavier, the bucket teeth scraping like they were biting into stone. Every scoop came up weightier than the last, and as each load hit the plant, the results shifted from promising to unreal. The gold count didn't rise in a slow curve. It spiked in sharp, staggering leaps. Cleanup after cleanup revealed richer mats, thicker streaks, and increasingly large pieces. Then, halfway through an afternoon run, they hit their first true nugget patch. Fat, rounded pieces clustered so tightly together it looked staged. Ancient gold, perfectly preserved, that had likely settled here long before modern rivers ever took shape. The deeper they chased, the more the channel stretched out beyond the cut. It didn't behave like a standard straight-line paleo channel. This one twisted, dipping and rising subtly beneath the ground. Fred brought out the ground-penetrating radar, scanning the surrounding area. The display lit up with an unmistakable pattern. Multiple pockets along a serpentine line, each one potentially loaded with trapped gold. A hidden river system frozen in time. A channel far bigger than even the most optimistic estimates. The crew stared at the map, silent for a moment as the scale of it set in. This wasn't just a promising cut. This was a full-season transformation, an entire claim redefined by one ancient, uplifted path of gold. But as they started widening the cut to follow the channel, the first signs of trouble appeared. Thin streams of water began trickling through the gravel walls, first as damp patches, then as steady seeping lines. The pressure increased by the hour. The deeper they dug, the more the water pushed its way through, threatening to weaken the entire cut. If the walls gave way, they'd lose equipment, time, and possibly the channel itself before they fully understood its extent. The crew radios crackled constantly with warnings: small collapses, soft spots, shifting gravel. Fred examined the seepage, tracing it back to a point where the channel dipped slightly. It wasn't groundwater, it was flow, ancient channel water trapped and redirected by the uplift, now finding its way out because they'd breached the edge. Fred didn't back down. Instead, he mapped out improvised trenches, carving diversion lines around the cut to guide the water away from the work zone. They dug shallow channels leading downhill, stabilizing the walls enough to buy time. The diverted water ran clear for a moment, then turned cloudy as it scraped fine sediment from deeper layers. Within minutes, the runoff glittered with tiny flakes, proof that the channel continued further than they'd reached. It meant the source was still ahead of them, still untouched, still rich enough to keep feeding gold into the flow. With the walls trembling, the cuts softening, and the machinery straining under the workload, they knew they had only one chance left before they'd be forced to shut the deep zone down. One final run, one last push to see what the channel held before the water forced them to retreat. Fred gathered the crew, gave the signal, and they fed the plant with everything the excavator could scoop in the limited time they had left. The plant roared through the final run, the patched feeder rattling under the load, the sluice boxes glowing under the slurry as if lit from within. When they finally shut down and pulled the mats, the scale of what they'd uncovered hit them all at once. The riffles were packed, solid, heavy, layered with coarse gold from end to end. Not dust, not streaks, but piles. The biggest cleanup of Fred's entire mining career, overflowing with both ancient placer gold and larger fragments likely pushed upward by the fault uplift. The first weigh-in stunned the crew, the second left them speechless. And by the time they tallied the full season total, the number crossed not just the line of success, not just the line of redemption, but an unimaginable threshold: $90 million worth of gold. But the gold wasn't the only discovery. When the geologists reviewed the channel's structure, the uplifted deposits, the twisted shape revealed by radar, and the unique vertical migration pattern, they confirmed something unprecedented. Fred hadn't just uncovered a pay line. He'd mapped a previously unknown geological structure, an uplifted paleo-channel system unlike anything documented in the Yukon, a structure now officially recognized as part of a newly identified fault zone, reshaping the geological understanding of the region. The crew realized the impact instantly. The depth and length of the channel meant this wasn't a one-season wonder. It could sustain multiple years of mining, multiple expansions, multiple high-yield zones waiting to be opened. Everything that had looked like bad luck, the breakdowns, the trench, the confusing patches of coarse gold, had actually been clues pointing to a once-in-a-generation deposit. As the season wound down and the last pieces of equipment shut off, Fred stood at the edge of the cut, looking over the twisted channel path, the walls marked by gold-rich layers, and the runoff trenches still carrying tiny flakes downstream. Broken equipment hadn't stopped them. Strange geology hadn't confused them. Water hadn't drowned the season. Instead, every obstacle had pushed them deeper into a place no miner before them had ever reached. A place where time, pressure, uplift, and chance had combined to create a gold surge powerful enough to rewrite the entire season and the entire region's geological history.